Okay, so you know when something blows up online and everyone's talking about it and you're just like, wait, what happened?
Yeah, totally.
We're going to break it all down.
Absolutely.
Today, we are deep diving into all the drama surrounding Jess Hilarious and her role on The Breakfast Club.
Definitely a lot to unpack here.
For sure, we've got transcripts from Jess's own videos where she's talking about her experience.
Right?
We've got some interesting commentary from another creator chiming in on the situation.
Yeah.
And of course, we have that on-air conversation between Jess and Loren LaRosa, which got pretty intense.
Yeah, it did.
So for anyone who needs a quick reminder, The Breakfast Club is hosted by Charlamagne, the God,
Of course.
DJ Envy,
Right.
and now Jess Hilarious.
Yes.
And Loren LaRosa is also a key part of the show, mainly handling the news updates.
Right.
All right, so let's get into it. Starting with Jess's own perspective. What were some of the initial frustrations that she was sharing in her solo videos?
Well, one of the first things that really stood out was this feeling from Jess that she wasn't being supported by her co-hosts when it came to the online criticism she was facing. She specifically said not one person on the team had her back when it came to defending her against those negative comments online.
Wow.
And it seemed like that feeling of being out there on her own was a big part of why she decided to go live in the first place.
Oh, interesting.
So this brings up a really interesting question about the dynamics of working in a public-facing profession.
Yeah, for sure.
Like when one member of a team is getting all this negativity thrown at them, what is the responsibility of the rest of the team to step up and defend them?
It's a tough one.
It is.
And for Jess, it wasn't just about what was happening online. She also described the overall environment on the show itself as feeling like high school, which is a pretty loaded comparison.
You don't want to hear that about your workplace.
Right.
I mean, what kind of dynamics do you think that kind of description points to?
I mean, when I think of high school, I think of drama clique.
Yeah.
Unspoken rules.
Totally.
And
Yeah.
sometimes just this sense of competition in the air.
Yeah. And in a high-pressure environment like a live radio show, those kind of dynamics can really mess with the chemistry on air and even affect people's well-being behind the scenes.
Totally. And Jess even mentioned that she actually enjoyed her work outside of the studio more,
Right.
which really suggests that something wasn't quite right with her experience on The Breakfast Club.
Yeah, it definitely hints at a disconnect there.
Absolutely. And here's where things get really interesting. A major point of contention for Jess seems to be Loren LaRosa's increased presence on air.
Okay.
And specifically within Jess's own segment, Jess with the Mess.
Right.
Jess was very upfront about having reservations about this expanded role for Loren when she came back from maternity leave.
It was.
She mentioned that there was a whole plan in place for her return. So it sounds like she had certain expectation about what things would look like and that maybe those expectations weren't met.
Right. It makes you wonder about the conversations that happened beforehand and if maybe things shifted over time.
Totally. So just to clarify, Jess had personally selected Loren to cover for her during her maternity leave.
Yes.
So that's important context for understanding their dynamic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's just a level of trust and understanding between them at that point.
Right. And Jess was very clear that she saw Loren's initial role as a news producer,
Okay.
someone behind the scenes gathering information and getting those interview questions prepped.
Right.
But then when Loren started delivering those news reports on air during Jess's segment,
Uh-huh.
that's when things started to feel different for Jess.
I see. It's like the lines between the roles started to blur a bit.
Exactly. So in your experience, how common is it for roles to evolve within teams like this?
Oh, it happens all the time,
Yeah.
especially in fast-paced environments. Things change, needs change, people develop new skills,
Yeah.
and sometimes roles just naturally evolve as part of that.
Okay.
But the key is that everyone is on the same page. There needs to be open communication and mutual agreement about how those roles are shifting.
Totally.
Because when that doesn't happen, you can end up with exactly the kind of tension that Jess is describing.
Yeah, that feeling of boundaries being crossed or expectations not being met.
Right.
And it seems like communication, or maybe the lack of it, was a big issue here.
Yeah, it definitely comes up a lot in this whole situation.
So Jess said that when she came back from maternity leave, the first thing that was brought up,
Yeah.
it wasn't about her baby or her time off.
Wow.
It was negative online comments.
Mm.
She did mention that envy was an exception,
Okay.
but that must have been a really deflating experience to come back after such a big life event and to have that be the focus.
I can only imagine.
What do you think that says about the team's priorities in that moment?
Well, it kind of suggests that maybe they were more focused on managing external perceptions than on acknowledging what Jess was going through personally. It's like the pressure of maintaining a certain image online took precedence over her individual experience.
And that feeling that people wanted Loren to have more airtime was already there.
Exactly.
So this whole situation led to Jess actually proposing some alternative segment ideas.
Oh, interesting.
Like Brown Girl Grinding or Loren with the Latest.
Okay.
And to me, it felt like she was trying to find a solution.
Yeah.
Not necessarily trying to push Loren out,
Right.
but more like trying to carve out clear and distinct roles for each of them.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So what was your take on those suggestions?
I thought it was really proactive of her to not just complain, but to actually come up with concrete ideas that would allow both of them to shine.
Yeah, it shows a willingness to work things out and to find a way for everyone to contribute in a way that feels good.
Absolutely. And Jess also felt like she was getting credit for the news reporting that Loren was doing, which wasn't really her thing.
Right.
She made it clear that her approach on Jess with the Mess was more about reading headlines. Okay.
And offering her commentary, like what are people thinking about this?
Right, a more opinion-based comedic style.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Very different from straight news reporting.
Definitely. So how important do you think it is for on-air personalities to have those clearly defined roles and styles?
I think it's crucial.
Yeah.
For one thing, the audience needs to understand who's doing what.
Absolutely.
But also, it allows each personality to build their own brand and connect with listeners in their own unique way.
It's about consistency and clarity.
Right. And when those lines get blurred, it can lead to confusion for the listeners.
Totally.
And like in Jess's case, it can create internal friction where someone feels like their contribution isn't being recognized or appreciated.
For sure. And you know that little exchange they had about the do-rag?
Oh, yeah, that was interesting.
I thought that really highlighted the difference in their styles and how seriously they approach certain topics.
Yeah, Jess made a joke, and Loren's response was much more serious.
Right. It was like a little glimpse into their different on-air personas. Totally. And all of this seemed to fuel this feeling for Jess that there was a negative narrative building around her online.
Okay.
Where she was being painted as the villain. And she felt like her co-hosts weren't doing enough to correct that perception.
I see. So that lack of public support was really getting to her.
Yeah. And she even directly addressed Charlamagne about it.
Wow.
Asking if he was even aware of the online chatter, which really shows how frustrated she was with the whole situation.
It does. And she also made a really important point about the internet and how it often creates these divisions between people.
Yeah.
Especially women.
Right. It's like people are constantly being pitted against each other.
It's sad, but it's true.
And Jess felt like these internal issues weren't being addressed effectively behind the scenes either. She talked about having off-air conversations, even meetings that didn't seem to lead to any real change or resolution.
So what do you think that says about how the team handles conflict?
Well, it seems like maybe they're good at talking about things.
Yeah. But not so good at actually finding solutions and putting them into action.
Right. Because if you don't address the root of the problem, it's just going to keep coming back up.
Exactly. And Jess even drew a contrast between the lack of support she felt around this online criticism versus the support she got during that whole Corey Holcomb situation.
That's an interesting comparison.
What do you think might explain that difference?
Well, maybe they saw the Corey Holcomb thing as more of a direct threat to the show's image. Or maybe it was just a clearer situation where everyone agreed on how to respond.
Right.
It could also point to some inconsistencies in how they offer support within the team.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on the nature of the conflict or who's involved.
And don't forget, Jess has been on the show for 15 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a long time.
So you would think there would be a certain level of loyalty and camaraderie there.
You would think so.
And she said that she was quiet for a reason for a while before going live. Which suggests that these issues had been building up for a while, right? It wasn't just a sudden outburst.
Yeah.
It was more like a slow burn.
Yeah. And she also pointed out that she had advocated for Loren to have her own segment, Loren with the Latest, which I thought was important to highlight.
Yeah, it shows that her issue wasn't with Loren being on the show per se.
Exactly.
It was more about how Loren's role was overlapping with her own existing segment.
Right. And then Jess used some pretty strong language,
Let's see.
saying she felt played with.
Wow.
And even hinting at wanting to return the favor.
So there was definitely a sense of betrayal there.
Yeah. What are the implications when team members start feeling that way?
It's never good.
Right.
When trust starts to erode, like they can really damage the whole team dynamic.
Yeah.
People get resentful. They lose motivation. Communication breaks down.
Yeah.
And it can create a really toxic environment.
And she even brought up Angela Yee's departure.
Oh, interesting.
Wondering if maybe that was connected to similar unresolved issues.
So she's suggesting there might be a pattern here.
Yeah, like these tensions aren't isolated incidents.
Right. It's more like a systemic problem within the show's dynamic.
And then Jess said something that really stuck with me.
What was that?
She said she doesn't need to be there, but wanted to be there.
That's powerful.
I know. It really shows how much she cared about the show.
Yeah.
But also how disillusioned she had become with her experience.
Right. It got to the point where she was questioning her whole involvement.
Yeah. And her final comment about the show being run like a high school really brings us back to that initial assessment of the environment.
It's like a full circle moment.
It is. And
Yeah.
she even talked about how her maternity leave happened at a less than ideal time in her career.
Oh, wow.
But that it was intentional, which shows her commitment to both her family and her career goals.
Yeah.
And maybe even highlights the pressure she might have felt trying to navigate all of this workplace drama during such a big personal transition.
That's a lot to deal with all at once.
It is. So let's shift gears for a moment and consider the perspective from that other creator on the IQ Shahid video.
Okay.
So this creator initially had a positive view of Jess, recognizing her comedic talent and how she represented her Baltimore roots,
Right.
which really resonated with audiences.
It did.
But over time, their perception of Jess changed.
How
They started to see her as becoming big-headed with her success. Like,
Yeah.
she hadn't really put in the work to justify certain expectations.
That's a pretty harsh assessment.
It is. And they contrasted Jess's experience with Loren's background at TMZ.
Right, which is a much more traditional media environment.
Exactly. So what are your thoughts on comparing different career paths like that?
Well, it's tricky
Yeah.
because different paths come with different skills and experiences.
Right.
And it's not always fair to compare them directly.
Totally. Like, Loren's time at TMZ probably instilled a certain set of professional norms,
For sure.
while Jess's rise through social media might have emphasized different things.
Right, like direct audience engagement and a more unfiltered style.
Exactly. And this creator also had a pretty strong opinion about online criticism.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they felt like it's just part of being in the public eye, and that co-hosts shouldn't necessarily feel obligated to defend each other against it.
Okay, so a more tough love approach.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, you gotta have thick skin if you're gonna be in this game.
And they also suggested that Jess should have addressed her issues with her co-hosts directly instead of going live on social media.
Which is a more traditional view of how to handle workplace conflicts.
It is. What do you think are the pros and cons of going public versus keeping things internal?
Well, addressing things internally can help to preserve team unity
Right.
and avoid a lot of unnecessary drama.
Yeah.
But if internal communication isn't working, or if someone feels like they're not being heard,
Yeah.
going public can sometimes feel like the only option.
It can definitely be a way to force a conversation.
Right. And this creator also suggested that Jess might be overestimating her own importance, calling her a rookie
Wow.
who needs more experience beyond social media.
That's a pretty bold statement.
It is. It really highlights the debate about different paths to success in media,
Yeah.
like traditional media versus the rise of social media influencer.
Right. And where each path fits into the hierarchy.
And they also questioned whether Jess's sensitivity levels were compatible with her role on Jess with the Mess.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, because her whole segment is about dissecting messy situations.
Right.
So how do you balance that with being personally affected by criticism or feeling slighted?
It's a tough line to walk.
It is. And this creator had a very specific approach to dealing with online negativity.
Okay, what was that?
They either ignored it or fired back, but
Right.
definitely no crying about it.
So very different from the emotions that Jess was expressing.
Yeah. And they also picked up on the fact that Jess was speaking in the past tense, which led them to believe that she might be thinking about leaving the show.
Interesting. So they were reading into the nuances of her language.
Yeah. And they felt like if Jess was unhappy, a simple online announcement of her departure would have been a cleaner way to handle it.
So more straightforward and less emotionally charged.
Right. And then there's the whole ongoing conflict between Jess and Corey Holcomb,
All right.
which adds another layer to all of this.
It does. It makes you wonder if there are some recurring patterns in how Jess handles disagreements.
Yeah. And this creator's final assessment was pretty harsh.
What did they say?
They felt like Jess's complaints came across as entitled, especially after achieving fame and having cosmetic surgery.
Wow. That's a lot to unpack in one stage.
It is. It's definitely a much more critical and less empathetic perspective than what we heard from Jess.
Yeah, and they even questioned Jess's initial claim about not liking Loren.
Right.
Calling it fake.
Yeah. So you can see how polarized the interpretations of this whole situation are.
Totally. It's like everyone has their own version of events.
Okay, so let's finally dive into that on-air conversation between Jess and Loren.
Okay.
This is where we get to hear from them directly.
Right from the source.
And you can feel the tension right away.
Yeah, it's palpable.
Charlamagne even frames Jess's Instagram Live as her going crazy.
Which sets a pretty charged tone.
It does. And then Loren talks about running into Jess in the elevator that morning.
Okay.
And admitting that she felt thrown off by the live video.
So awkward.
I know. It really highlights the disconnect between them at that point.
Yeah, they're not on the same page at all.
And Loren says, let's talk calmly, which seems to indicate a preference for handling things privately.
Right, which makes sense. It's a more professional approach.
But it also makes you wonder if those private conversations were ever happening effectively before all of this went public.
That's the key question.
And Loren also makes a really important point.
What's that?
She feels like the issue goes beyond just online comments, and that some of her own feelings actually align with the public sentiment. So it's not just about defending Jess against negativity.
Right, Loren might have her own perspective on the situation.
Exactly, which adds another layer of complexity.
It does. And then Loren expresses frustration that nothing has really changed despite previous discussions.
Which mirrors what Jess was saying earlier.
Right, about those off-air conversations not leading to any resolution.
Yeah, it shows a real breakdown in their ability to find common ground.
And then there's that moment where Loren says she's seen Jess cry a lot.
Oh, yeah.
It almost feels like she's trying to downplay the significance of Jess's emotions.
Yeah. How do you think that came across?
Probably not very well.
Right. It could be seen as dismissive or invalidating.
Exactly. Like she's not taking Jess's feelings seriously.
And then Loren pivots to talking about finding a way to work together.
Okay.
She uses that East Side High, West Side High analogy to emphasize that they're in this together, even though they might have their differences.
Yeah, it's a way of saying, let's find a way to make this work.
But she also acknowledges that part of Jess's live video was crazy.
So she's not completely on board with how Jess handled things.
Right. And then Jess addresses some of the specific things that were bothering her.
Like what?
Feeling talked over?
Yeah.
Being told to hush or be quiet on air?
Ouch. Those are some pretty serious accusations.
They are. It's about feeling silenced and disrespected.
And Jess says that these things weren't addressed privately, which would have made her feel even worse.
Right. It's like being undermined in front of everyone.
And Loren says she doesn't recall saying those specific things.
So we have a classic he said, she said situation.
Right, where the same interactions are being remembered and interpreted very differently.
And Jess then says that she's not going to fight for a mic, implying that as an established member of the show, she shouldn't have to.
Yeah, it's about feeling like her voice should be heard and respected.
And she asserts that she's a grown-ass woman who doesn't need to be talked to like that.
It's about demanding respect and professional courtesy.
Exactly. And she reminds Loren that she told her from the jump that she would address issues directly.
So she's setting an expectation for how she wants to be treated.
Right. And she brings up the whole internet pitting women against each other thing again.
Right. That seems to be a recurring theme for her.
It does.
Yeah.
And she emphasizes her initial support of Loren's opportunities on the show.
It's like she's saying, I was rooting for you.
Yeah. And Loren then urges Jess to stop letting the internet control the narrative.
That's interesting.
Which aligns with what Charlamagne said earlier.
Right, about not feeding into the online frenzy.
And Loren mentions a previous negative experience of trying to address issues with Jess publicly. Which might explain why she's hesitant to do it again.
Yeah. It sounds like it didn't go well the first time.
And she clarifies that she doesn't dislike Jess.
Oh, okay.
And that she actually hoped for a positive working relationship when Jess came back.
So the current tension is probably disappointing for her, too.
Yeah. It sounds like she had different expectations.
And she acknowledges that Jess's return was crazy with all the focus on online comments. So they're finding some common ground there.
They are. And Loren says she'd rather find solutions than argue.
Which is a healthy approach.
It is. And then there's that little joke about Loren being the #1 B-raised person without resolutions.
Oh, yeah. Trying to lighten the mood a bit.
Yeah. But it also subtly points to the fact that they're still not resolving things.
True. And Loren does express care for Jess.
Okay.
And reminds her that as a producer, her job is to support the talent. So she's framing their relationship in a professional context.
Right. And in the end, they both agree that the show can feel like a goddamn high school.
Wow. Coming full circle.
I know. So after all of that, what are some of the key takeaways?
Well, it's clear that Jess felt unsupported by her co-hosts.
Yeah.
Especially when it came to dealing with online criticism.
Uh-huh.
She was uncomfortable with how the on-air dynamics were changing.
Right.
Particularly Loren's increased role in her segment.
And communication seems to have been a major issue.
Definitely. They weren't effectively addressing these tensions behind the scenes.
So we have Jess feeling unsupported and frustrated.
Right.
Loren wanting to communicate directly and find solutions.
Yeah.
And then that external creator offering a much more critical perspective. It's a lot to process.
It is.
But hopefully now you, the listener, have a much clearer picture of what went down.
Absolutely.
You've gotten the full story without having to scroll through endless social media posts.
That's the goal.
So here's a final thought for you to consider.
Okay.
Given all of this drama, what are the challenges of building and maintaining a strong team while also allowing each individual to shine?
Yeah.
Especially in a high-pressure environment like the Breakfast Club.
Right, where everything is so public and scrutinized.
It's a tough balance to strike.
It is, and it makes you think about how people can navigate these situations more effectively.
Yeah.
To create a more supportive and productive work environment.
Absolutely. Lots to ponder. All right, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been real.
Until next time.
See ya.